Hi everybody, welcome back to the Space Blast. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about one of the most historic rockets ever built. Imagine a spaceship that launches like a rocket, flies like a satellite, and lands like an airplane. Sounds crazy, right? Well, NASA actually built one of these. It was called the Space Shuttle, and it was the world's first reusable spacecraft and one of the most complex machines ever built by humans. So without a doubt, let's get started. From April 12, 1981 to July 21st, 2011, the Space Shuttle served for 135 missions, launched over 600 astronauts, helped repair telescopes, helped launch satellites, and helped build the International Space Station. And today, we're going to dissect it piece by piece and learn how this was such an important spacecraft. So without a doubt, let's dive in. But first, let's cue the new Space Blast intro. Why did NASA build the Space Shuttle? You see, let's rewind back to the 1960s. Back then, rockets were only single use. You would launch them once, and then once you deploy the payload, you would dump them into the ocean never to be used again. That's expensive and a waste of money. So NASA had a crazy idea. What if we could launch a rocket, send it back to Earth, and do that again, and again, and again? In 1972, the US approved the project, and shortly after that, construction began on the new Space Shuttle. But what made the Space Shuttle unique? Well, here's the thing. The Space Shuttle was not just one giant thing, no. It's actually comprised of three major working parts. The first part is the orbiter, the part that looks like an airplane. This is where the astronauts live, and this is the part that's called the Space Shuttle. Attached to it is the big orange blob known as the external tank, which gives fuel to the orbiter. And attached to the external tank are the two solid rocket boosters, which give the extra boost during liftoff. Together, the Space Shuttle weighed at approximately 4.5 million pounds, and after liftoff, the Space Shuttle would reach an altitude at around 115 to 400 miles above Earth at a speed of 17,500 miles per hour. Crazy, right? Well, wait till you learn about each individual part. Now, let's talk about the orbiter, the heart of the Space Shuttle. The orbiter is the part everybody recognizes. It looks like a space plane. Inside the orbiter were a cockpit, living spaces, a huge cargo bay, and the three main engines to the Space Shuttle. The orbiter was the size of a DC-9 airplane. It would usually carry 7 astronauts, but on some missions it carried 8. And along with that, it would carry huge payloads like satellites, telescopes, and even space station parts. Man, that's heavy. Now, let's go more specific and go inside the crew module. Inside the crew module was a flight deck where the pilots sit and control the spacecraft. There was a mid-deck where the astronauts would eat, sleep, and go to the bathroom, and an airlock for outdoor spacewalk activities. And here's a crazy fact. Inside the flight deck were over 2,000 switches and controls. Yes, you heard me, 2,000. Imagine learning to drive that. No thanks, I'll pass on that. Now, let's move further down a bit. where we will see the payload bay. The space shuttle had a very huge payload bay. Inside, it would carry satellites, telescopes, space station parts, you name it. It also had a robotic arm called the Canadarm, used to grab objects inside the payload bay. Man, the technology! Now, let's go all the way down to see the main engines of the shuttle. The shuttle had three main RS-25 engines. These engines ran on liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. Temperatures inside the engine could reach up to 6,000 degrees Fahrenheit. That's even hotter than lava. And to make things worse, these engines will be running for 8.5 minutes to push the shuttle up to its designed orbit. And not only that, these engines have to last for many missions since they're being reused. Do they even melt? These things are stronger than anything I've ever seen. Now, let's move to the only other part of the space shuttle that has engines. The solid rocket boosters. Attached to each side of the external tank were the two solid rocket boosters. These provided most of the power at liftoff. Together, they produced over 5 million pounds of thrust. But they only lasted for 2 minutes. Once those 2 minutes ran up, they jettisoned those two solid rocket boosters and they fell into the ocean. And you guessed it, they were reused. Yes, NASA was also reusing those boosters, and yes, NASA was fishing rockets out of the ocean like toys. Man, is there anything that they don't reuse at all? Well, let's see. Now, let's move on to the only part we haven't talked about. The external tank. That big orange tank? That holds the fuel to the space shuttle. Inside, it carries liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. But here's the catch. The space shuttle external tank was the only part that was not reused. So, once the fuel ran out, the space shuttle would jettison it and it would burn up in the atmosphere, never to be seen again. Man, so I guess there was something that NASA didn't reuse. How many space shuttle orbiters were ever built? You see, NASA has built 5 space shuttle orbiters during the space shuttle program. They were called Space Shuttle Columbia, Space Shuttle Challenger, Space Shuttle Atlantis, Space Shuttle Discovery, and Space Shuttle Endeavour. Each one has its own backstory. Space Shuttle Columbia was the first space shuttle to ever launch. Space Shuttle Challenger was the second space shuttle to ever launch. Space Shuttle Discovery flew the most missions. Space Shuttle Atlantis flew on the last space shuttle mission ever. And Space Shuttle Endeavour was built as a replacement for Space Shuttle Challenger. Stay tuned to the end of the video to see what happens to Space Shuttle Challenger. But with that, let's move on. But what did the Space Shuttle achieve? You see, the Space Shuttle did a lot during its 135-year lifespan. It helped build the International Space Station, it helped repair satellites, it launched telescopes, it conducted science experiments, it sent thousands of astronauts to space, you name it. The Space Shuttle's longest mission was 17.5 days, which is nothing compared to today's astronauts. Not only that, it completed 135 missions through a 30-year lifespan. Man, that's a good program. But, as you'll see in just a bit, it was not all sunshines and rainbows for the shuttle program. The shuttle program also had some tragedies and disasters of its own, like in 1986 with the Space Shuttle Challenger. 72 seconds into launch, the Space Shuttle Challenger violently exploded. It would ultimately claim the lives of 7 astronauts with it. The cause was traced to an O-ring seal. You see, temperatures the night before the launch were so cold that the O-ring seals started to not function properly. And because of that, gases started escaping the O-ring seals, and this would lead to the eventual demise of the Space Shuttle Challenger. The Space Shuttle program would have a break until 2003 with the Space Shuttle Columbia incident. Everything looked fine. Launch looked fine. But, in fact, it wasn't. During launch, a piece of foam struck the left wing of the Space Shuttle Columbia. Experts didn't think much of it, but little did they know this would have lethal causes. You see, that piece of foam left a hole in the heat shield, and during re-entry, hot plasma gases got inside this hole and started melting components inside the Space Shuttle. This would eventually lead to the demise of the Space Shuttle Columbia as it burned up, and along with it, all the 7 astronauts on board. But here's the thing. NASA learned from their mistakes, and they started to improve their safety. But it's still a reminder that spaceflight is dangerous and hard. And now we have made it. It's the end of an era. It's the final frontier. On July 21st, 2011, Space Shuttle Atlantis landed back at Kennedy Space Center one last time. The Space Shuttle program had ended. After 30 years, the world's first reusable spacecraft retired. But its legacy still continues, as rockets nowadays learn from the Space Shuttle. And to be honest, the Space Shuttle was my favorite rocket growing up as a child. In fact, this rocket model was given to me as my birthday gift, and I still have it now. And I hope, just like me, that even you are inspired by the Space Shuttle, because honestly, it's one of the coolest rockets out there. The Space Shuttle was not perfect. It was complicated and dangerous, but it was also brilliant, historic, and unforgettable. It proved to humans that a rocket can go to space, come back, and do it again, and again, and again. And before I end this video, I wanted to show you guys something that means something special to me. This poster right here was given from my neighbor who worked at NASA. Right here, this shows some of the plans that NASA wanted to do with the external tank. You see, since the external tank couldn't be reused, NASA thought to make it as some sort of station. Obviously, we know that didn't happen, but it still seems cool to know what they were thinking back then. And honestly, it's a very cool poster. With that, before you leave, please make sure to hit the like and subscribe button and smash that notification bell to receive updates on future content that I post. Thank you so much for joining the Space Blast. You rock! Until then, see you next time.
Work.
20.
Firing chain is armed.
15.
Go for main engine start. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. All 3 engines up and burning. 2, 1, 0, and liftoff. The final liftoff of Atlantis on the shoulders of the Space Shuttle. America will continue the dream.
Roger, roll, Atlantis. Houston now controlling the flight of Atlantis. The Space Shuttle spreads its wings one final time for the start of a sentimental journey into history. 24 seconds into the flight, roll program complete. Atlantis now heads down, wings level on the proper alignment for its 8.5-minute ride to orbit. 4.5 million pounds of hardware and humans taking aim on the International Space Station. 40 seconds into the flight, the 3 liquid fuel main engines throttling back to 72% of rated performance in the bucket, reducing stress on the shuttle as it goes transonic for the final time. Engines now revving up, standing by for the throttle up call. 15 miles in altitude, already 16 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center, 1 minute 40 seconds into the flight. Atlantis flexing its muscles one final time. Atlantis traveling almost 2,600 miles an hour, 21 miles in altitude, 24 miles downrange, standing by for solid rocket booster separation.